It all began in Tombstone, Arizona Territory, on the 14th of July, 1881, when the sun hammered down on mud brick walls like the fist of an angry god. Inside the territorial jail, a man named William Claiborne sat on a wooden bench, staring at a bowl of vanilla ice cream. The metal spoon felt heavier than any iron shackle he had ever imagined, and the cold sweetness on his tongue tasted like something from a dream he couldn't remember having. Outside, the desert baked at 107 degrees, but inside this cell, condensation beaded on tin cups filled with German lager, and the air smelled faintly of lime wash and fresh bread. Claiborne had ridden with some of the hardest men in the territory, men who wore their scars like medals and spoke of jail time the way soldiers spoke of battlefields. He had prepared himself for darkness, for the stink of human waste, for the kind of brutal indifference that turned men into animals. What he didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that comfort could be more brutal than any beating, and that the frontier had already learned what the rest of the world would take decades to discover: the belief. For centuries, imprisonment had meant suffering, a philosophy inherited from medieval dungeons where punishment served as both justice and entertainment. Eastern jails in places like New York's Tombs or Philadelphia's Walnut Street Prison operated on principles of deliberate deprivation, where darkness and disease worked as instruments of moral correction. Southern chain gangs turned incarceration into public theater, with prisoners breaking rocks under armed guard, while citizens watched from passing carriages, reassured by the visible evidence of state power crushing individual defiance. The outlaws of the 1870s and 80s built their entire identity around endurance through this expected brutality, crafting a mythology of resistance that turned jail time into a badge of honor among their brotherhood. When men like Jesse James or the younger brothers spoke about their incarcerations, they described torture and deprivation with a kind of pride, transforming suffering into proof of their unbreakable spirits. The Bandit Code prepared young criminals to expect starvation rations, contaminated water, beatings from guards who enjoyed their work, and cells designed to strip away everything except the will to survive. Their mental armor had been forged specifically to withstand cruelty, calibrated to find strength in victimhood, and they rode toward their arrests with a grim readiness to prove themselves through endurance. This expectation created a strange psychological contract between outlaw and lawman, where both sides understood imprisonment as a test of will rather than a simple removal from society. The criminal anticipated torture and prepared to resist it, while the Eastern establishment believed that suffering purified the soul through systematic degradation of the flesh. But out in the territories, where government money met plain frontier sense, people were already changing the way prisoners were treated. The Western territories operated under economic constraints that Eastern states had never confronted, funding their law enforcement through a complex web of federal subsidies, bounty payments, and per-prisoner reimbursements that transformed incarceration from moral theater into financial calculation. A territorial sheriff in places like Arizona, New Mexico, or Oklahoma received federal payments based on the number of prisoners successfully delivered to trial, with additional compensation for housing, feeding, and maintaining each captive until their court date arrived. The system created a perverse but powerful incentive structure where dead prisoners represented lost revenue, escaped prisoners meant forfeited bounties, and sick prisoners required expensive medical interventions that came from the sheriff's own operational budget. This financial architecture produced a radical reimagining of what a jail should accomplish, replacing punishment with retention, substituting degradation with investment. The so-called hotel jails began appearing across territorial capitals in the 1880s, facilities that featured whitewashed cells with proper ventilation, regular meal service that met or exceeded the dietary standards of local boarding houses, and medical care that often surpassed what free citizens could access in frontier towns. Sheriffs who understood the mathematics realized that spending 12 cents per day on quality food was cheaper than losing a $50 bounty to pneumonia or paying a doctor $3 to treat dysentery caused by contaminated water. The ice cream and beer weren't acts of kindness, but rather calculated demonstrations of municipal sophistication and systemic control. Ice production required substantial infrastructure investment, including ice houses with double-wall construction, sawdust insulation, and supply chains that moved frozen blocks across hundreds of miles of desert terrain before mechanical refrigeration made such efforts obsolete. When a sheriff served ice cream to prisoners in July, he was simultaneously proving his facility's access to cutting-edge preservation technology, demonstrating his supply chain's reliability, and sending an unmistakable psychological message about the reach and capability of territorial administration. The beer served similar purposes, as brewery partnerships provided consistent income for local businesses while offering prisoners a taste of normalcy that made escape seem less urgent than simply waiting out their sentence in relative comfort. Eastern jails broke bodies through deliberate cruelty, operating on the assumption that punishment required suffering to achieve its moral purpose. Western jails broke mythologies through unexpected hospitality, destroying the outlaw's carefully constructed identity as a man too tough to be controlled by civilized society. The frontier sheriff didn't need his prisoner to suffer. He needed his prisoner to stay put, show up for trial, and generate the paperwork that would trigger federal reimbursement payments. Comfort wasn't mercy in this context, but rather the most efficient tool available for prisoner retention and cost management. The infrastructure required to maintain these hotel jails revealed the true scope of territorial ambition, with supply networks that stretched from Kansas City packing houses to San Francisco ice importers. Federal marshal districts negotiated bulk purchasing agreements for flour, beef, coffee, and tobacco, achieving economies of scale that made quality provisioning cheaper than the minimal rations that characterized Eastern facilities. Sheriffs attended regional conferences where they compared notes on prisoner retention rates, meal costs per capita, and the optimal balance between comfort and security, transforming law enforcement into a profession that valued accounting skills as highly as marksmanship. The system sounded good on paper, but its true measure came when real men, real outlaws, stepped through those doors. If you find this video, hit subscribe and ride along as we see how history still shapes today. First encounter, when the Dalton gang surrendered to federal marshals in Guthrie, Oklahoma Territory. On the 6th of October, 1892, they arrived at the territorial jail with the swagger of men who had already survived the worst that civilization could inflict upon them. Bob Dalton had spent time in Kansas territorial facilities. Grat Dalton knew the inside of half a dozen county lockups, and all of them carried stories about surviving on wormy bread and floor sleeping that had become part of their collective identity. They expected iron bunks bolted to stone walls. They anticipated guards who would use any excuse to deliver a beating, and they prepared themselves mentally to endure months of deliberate deprivation as the price of their chosen profession. What they received instead was a shock so profound that it appeared in multiple newspaper accounts over the following weeks, described by journalists who seemed almost embarrassed to report the details. The Guthrie facility provided individual cells with actual mattresses stuffed with fresh straw, replaced weekly to prevent insect infestation. Meals arrived 3 times daily on tin plates that were washed between uses, featuring beef stew with potatoes, cornbread with butter, coffee with sugar, and on Sundays, apple pie that the sheriff's wife baked in batches of 24. The prisoners received cigars twice weekly, access to newspapers only 3 days old, and permission to receive visitors without the glass barriers that characterized Eastern facilities. The psychological tension created by this treatment manifested in ways that the marshals documented with careful attention to behavioral changes. Within the first week, the Dalton brothers stopped making escape plans, a shift that became apparent when guards discovered they had ceased testing window bars and studying guard rotation schedules. Grant Dalton reportedly told a visiting minister that returning to the outlaw trail meant giving up regular meals and sleeping on hard ground, a cost-benefit analysis that would have been unthinkable under the traditional punishment model. The mythology that had sustained their criminal identity, the idea that they were hard men who thrived outside civilization's soft constraints, collapsed when confronted with the reality that civilization could provide comfort more reliably than their own community ever had. Contemporary newspapers from the Guthrie Daily Leader and the Oklahoma State Capitol documented multiple instances of prisoners requesting extended stays or expressing reluctance about their impending release dates. One account from November of 1892 described an outlaw named William Doolin asking the sheriff if he could remain incarcerated through winter rather than face trial immediately, preferring guaranteed shelter and food over the uncertainties of frontier survival during the cold months. This represented a complete inversion of the expected prisoner-jailer relationship, where the captive now viewed incarceration as preferable to freedom. Federal marshal reports compiled across Oklahoma, Arizona, and New Mexico territories between 1890 and 1895 revealed that recapture rates for escape prisoners dropped by approximately 40% in facilities that adopted hotel jail standards compared to traditional punishment-based lockups. The explanation became obvious to territorial administrators. Prisoners who had been treated well had no mythology of resistance to maintain, no story of survival through suffering to tell their fellow outlaws, and no burning desire for revenge against a system that had treated them with unexpected decency. The first encounter between outlaw expectations and territorial efficiency had produced something unprecedented in the history of American law enforcement. Prisoners who didn't want to leave. The transformation of territorial jails from punishment facilities into retention systems required a complete rebuilding of the physical and logistical infrastructure that connected remote frontier outposts to national supply networks. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway negotiated special contracts with territorial governments beginning in 1887, establishing refrigerated car schedules that prioritized jail deliveries alongside commercial freight, understanding that government contracts provided reliable revenue during economic downturns. These trains carried more than just food and ice. They transported the entire apparatus of modern administration into regions that had been functionally medieval only a decade earlier. The construction of territorial ice houses represented engineering achievements that rivaled many contemporary industrial projects in their sophistication and scale. The Prescott, Arizona facility, completed in 1889, featured double-wall construction with a 16-inch gap filled with alternating layers of sawdust and cork, creating insulation sufficient to maintain ice storage through summer months, when ambient temperatures exceeded 100 degrees for weeks at a time. The structure could hold approximately 40 tons of ice, harvested from mountain lakes during winter months, enough to supply not only the territorial jail, but also the local hospital, hotels, and restaurants that paid premium prices for reliable cold storage access. Water systems underwent similar transformations, as territorial administrators recognized that contaminated water supplies generated medical costs that dwarfed the expense of proper plumbing infrastructure. The Yuma Territorial Prison installed a filtration system in 1891 that processed Colorado River water through sand beds and charcoal filters, producing drinking water clean enough that facility physicians reported dysentery rates below 5% annually compared to rates exceeding 30% in nearby civilian communities. The same system provided water for laundry facilities that processed prisoner clothing and bedding on weekly cycles, maintaining hygiene standards that further reduced disease transmission and associated medical expenditures. Medical infrastructure expanded dramatically as sheriffs realized that preventing illness cost substantially less than treating advanced disease. The Santa Fe Territorial Jail employed a full-time physician beginning in 1888, paying him a salary of $75 monthly to conduct daily rounds, treat injuries, and maintain vaccination records that documented smallpox and typhoid immunization for every prisoner who entered the facility. This investment paid for itself within the first year, when a potential typhoid outbreak was identified and contained before spreading through the prisoner population, saving an estimated $800 in treatment costs and preventing the deaths that would have resulted in lost bounty payments and federal investigations. What emerged from these infrastructure investments wasn't just a collection of comfortable jails, but rather a complete parallel civilization that demonstrated the territorial government's capacity to project power through logistics rather than violence. By 1890, federal marshal districts across the Western Territories had begun standardizing what they called humane detention protocols, a bureaucratic phrase that disguised a revolution in the philosophy and practice of incarceration. The United States Marshals Service issued guidelines specifying minimum standards for cell ventilation, meal caloric content, medical care availability, and prisoner hygiene that exceeded the conditions in many free boarding houses throughout the frontier. These standards weren't imposed from humanitarian impulses, but rather from hard financial data showing that well-maintained prisoners cost less over time than sick, violent, or dead ones who generated paperwork, medical bills, and lost revenue. The production metrics that emerged from this systematization revealed the true scale of territorial ambition in transforming punishment into administration. Arizona Territory jails collectively served approximately 12,000 meals per month by 1895, requiring supply chains that coordinated shipments from Kansas beef processors, California produced distributors, and local dairies that had emerged specifically to serve institutional contracts. The Graham County facility in Safford kept detailed ledgers showing expenditures of $732 per month on provisions for an average prisoner population of 43 inmates, working out to roughly 17 cents per prisoner per day, a figure that would have been impossible without bulk purchasing agreements and efficient distribution networks. Brewery partnerships formalized into contractual relationships that benefited both parties while serving the Territorial Administration's prisoner retention goals. The Anheuser-Busch Company negotiated exclusive supply agreements with multiple territorial jail systems, providing beer at reduced wholesale rates in exchange for guaranteed purchase volumes and the implicit endorsement that came from association with federal law enforcement. Prisoners received beer rations 2 to 3 times weekly, enough to provide a taste of normalcy without creating intoxication problems that would undermine facility security or generate additional medical costs. The training protocols for territorial sheriffs evolved to emphasize psychology over violence, with federal marshals conducting regional workshops that taught administrative skills alongside traditional law enforcement techniques. Sheriffs learned to view their facilities as businesses that generated revenue through efficient operations, understanding that every escaped prisoner represented both a bounty lost and a potential increase in insurance premiums that territorial governments paid to cover liability risks. The most successful sheriffs were those who combined accounting competency with psychological insight, recognizing that bored prisoners caused fewer problems than brutalized ones, and that small investments in comfort, yielded substantial returns in reduced escape attempts and prisoner cooperation. The human consequences of this systematic transformation appeared most clearly in the collapse of outlaw cultural production, particularly the ballads and folk songs that had celebrated jail resistance as a form of heroism. Where previous generations of outlaws had produced verses about surviving torture, maintaining dignity through suffering, and plotting elaborate escapes against cruel jailers, the 1890s saw this tradition simply evaporate. There was no glory in accepting ice cream from your captor, no heroic narrative to construct around waiting patiently for trial while enjoying 3 meals daily and weekend tobacco rations, no way to transform comfortable captivity into the kind of suffering that proved manhood within outlaw culture. What had begun as a cost-saving measure in underfunded territories had accidentally created the prototype for modern correctional philosophy, where control emerged not from cruelty, but from systems so efficient that resistance itself became economically irrational. Ice cream and empire. By 1900, the era of the Western outlaw had effectively concluded, not in dramatic shootouts that filled dime novels, but through the quiet efficiency of administrative systems that had made banditry economically and psychologically unsustainable. Territorial jails boasted mortality rates that often fell below those of many Eastern hospitals, a statistical achievement that reflected both the quality of care provided and the perverse incentives that made dead prisoners expensive failures rather than moral victories. The federal government had spent approximately $4 million developing the territorial jail system across 2 decades, an investment that generated returns not through punishment, but through the systematic dismantling of outlaw culture through unexpected hospitality. The philosophical transformation that occurred in those Western facilities would echo through the entire 20th century as the prison industrial complex inherited and expanded upon the efficiency models first developed in territorial jails. Modern minimum security facilities, corporate incentive structures, and even military detention protocols all trace their conceptual lineage back to those frontier sheriffs who discovered that comfort could control more effectively than cruelty ever had. The innovation wasn't in being kind, but rather in recognizing that prisoner retention and cost management created incentives that happened to align with humane treatment, producing moral outcomes through amoral calculations. What changed because of this transformation extended far beyond criminal justice, influencing how American institutions approached control and compliance across multiple domains. The territorial jail model demonstrated that systems designed around economic efficiency could achieve social control more effectively than systems designed around moral punishment, a lesson that would be applied to everything from factory management to public education to military discipline. The 20th century became, in many ways, the century of systematized comfort, deployed as a tool of institutional power. The broader implications rippled through American society in ways that contemporaries could barely comprehend, as the efficiency principles refined in territorial jails informed progressive-era reforms, corporate welfare programs, and eventually the massive administrative apparatus of the New Deal. What began as sheriffs calculating per-prisoner costs evolved into entire schools of thought about how institutions could shape behavior through environmental design, rather than violent coercion. The outlaws who sat in those comfortable cells eating ice cream were witnessing the birth of modern behavioral management, though they lacked the conceptual framework to understand what was happening to them. The outlaws who rode into those territorial jails expecting crucibles of suffering had prepared themselves to resist the wrong enemy entirely. They had sharpened their spirits against anticipated brutality, built their identities around endurance through deprivation, and cultivated a mythology that transformed suffering into proof of authenticity. None of that preparation helped when confronted with sheriffs who offered cold beer on hot afternoons, with systems that valued their continued existence more than their abasement. with an administrative apparatus that had already calculated that comfort cost less than cruelty. And so the frontier didn't fall to bullets or bravery. It fell to balance sheets and ice cream. If you want more stories about how power hides in plain sight, subscribe and keep digging deeper into the machinery behind history.